Hey friends, welcome to another installment of Strange Planet. Few true crime stories grip you the way Bone Valley does. In Season 1, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Gilbert King peeled back the layers of one of the most jaw-dropping wrongful convictions in recent memory, helping secure Leo Schofield's release after 35 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Now, Season 2, launching April 9th of this year, takes us somewhere even darker, more complex, and profoundly human. This time, the spotlight is on Jeremy Scott, the man who confessed to the brutal 1987 murder of 18-year-old Michelle Schofield, a crime that sent her husband Leo to prison for decades. Through exclusive prison recordings, raw confrontations, and a bond that defies easy explanation, Gilbert King dives into the mind of a killer, exposing a justice system that shrugs at the truth even when it's screaming to be heard. How does a confessed murderer stay free while an innocent man languishes behind bars? What drives a system to double down on its mistakes? And what happens when a journalist finds himself connecting with a man capable of such violence? Gilbert King, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Devil in the Grove, shone a light on racial injustice in the Jim Crow South, joins us to unpack Bone Valley Season 2. This is a story of guilt, redemption, and a fight for justice that's far from finished. Gilbert, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
Oh, Richard, that was such an unbelievable introduction. Thank you so much. I hope I can live up to that. That was beautiful.
All right, so let's play catch up for our listeners. Tell us about the Schofield case, everything that we need to know about the murder and so forth.
Yeah, I'll just give you the gist of it. So
Yeah.
I was doing an author's talk down at a judicial conference in Florida, all judges there. And one judge came up to me when I was signing books and handed me a business card. And it basically said, Leo Scoffield, gave his prison number. He said, not just wrongfully convicted. He's an innocent man. And I remember just getting at this card, like a judge gave me this, and passed it around the dinner table with a bunch of lawyers. And they're like, judges aren't supposed to be saying those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
There's ethical canons and all things in place for that. And so one of the lawyers looked at it. He said, I know that case. You should call him. And I called the judge, and he started telling me, like, I know they railroaded this guy. I was involved in this case back in the 80s, and I know they railroaded this guy. And he's an innocent man. He's been in prison for 30-something years. And that was enough of an introduction to look into it. I looked into it. Basically, what happened was Leo Schofield's wife disappeared for a couple of days, and then they found her body floating in a phosphate pit. He always maintained his innocence, was convicted, sentenced to life in prison. And then about 17 years into his sentence, they found some unidentified fingerprints that were in her car that they were never able to identify. They ran them through the AFIS system, and they came back to a known killer who lived in the area. And so that was pretty much the story. Like, well, you have this murderer's fingerprints inside my wife's car, but the courts were not able to give any relief. And they said, oh, no, he used to steal a lot of stereos. That's probably why they were there. And then 10 years after that, he confessed to the murder in detail, and they still wouldn't believe him. And so that's been the story. These two guys, Leo Schofield and Jeremy Scott, both connected to the same murder of Michelle Schofield. And the state doesn't believe either one of them. And so Leo's been in prison for 36 years. And that's pretty much the story of Bone Valley 1. And we talked to both Leo and to Jeremy and pretty much got to the bottom of it, I think, by the end of it.
So just going back to 1987 for a moment, Michelle Schofield, 18, as you say, when she was found, she stabbed something like 26 times, found in this
Yes.
phosphate pit or canal.
Right.
What do we know about that night? I mean, where she was, who saw her last, how did the investigation zero in on Leo, her husband, so quickly?
It's a great question. It started out where Leo was a hard rock and roll band. He's in a heavy metal band, and Michelle is working as a waitress at this place called Tom's Restaurant. And he's just waiting for her to show up at the band practice. They're going to go out to dinner afterwards. And she just doesn't show. And then they're worried about at 9:45, he gets a call from her saying, okay, I finished doing some laundry. I'm heading right over there. Do you want me to pick up some McDonald's or something? And he says, no, just come over. We'll go out from here. And so he's waiting and waiting. She never shows up. And he starts to freak out. He's like calling everybody, calling his parents, like, this is not like her. She said she'd be here. It should have been 10 or 15 minutes. Hours start passing. Calls the sheriff, does a bunch of missing persons reports, spends the next 2 days searching for her with search parties and family members. 2 days later, they find her car on the side of Interstate 4, just outside of Lakeland. And they start searching backwards from where the car was back to the restaurant where she was last known to be. And Leo's father on day 3 finds Michelle's body in this little area called the Cut. It's like a little makeout area. And, it's just highly traumatic, but there's no evidence connecting Leo to this case. He's got a pretty strong alibi. He was searching with friends and family for the last 3 days. But there's some witnesses in the trailer park that they lived in who said, yeah, I saw that couple fighting a lot. And slowly the police start zeroing in on Leo. And basically what happens is you have a really aggressive prosecutor who's really good at circumstantial cases, even though there's no evidence connecting Leo to this crime, and basically does this character assassination by just bringing in all these witnesses. He's got a temper. He likes to fight. He does all this. And, they fought all the time, and builds the case around that. And Leo gets convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And that's pretty much how the investigation turned. It was really, it was not the police. A lot of times you see police doing things that are a little suspect. This was a prosecutor who really took this story and made it work. And he was very good at this. He was very aggressive. And Leo, unfortunately, had kind of a defense attorney who was lost in a different era and didn't really know how to fight a case like this.
Again, now season 2 shifts to Jeremy Scott, the man who confessed to killing Michelle Schofield. His fingerprints, as you mentioned, found in Michelle's car, but not identified until, 2004, was it?
Exactly, yeah, 2004.
15 years after Leo's conviction. I mean, obvious question, why did it take so long for them to find these fingerprints, and what does that say about the original police work?
It says a lot about the original police work because one of the detectives who was working on the case had investigated a previous murder that Jeremy had committed and got away with. And so he knew that this guy was out there in this area and that he was out free from prison because he got acquitted. And so he's floating around this same town. This one detective knew Jeremy really well. It's a pretty small town. So it's kind of striking that the same detective who's looking into the Leo Scoffield case doesn't put it together and say, hey, back then they didn't have the automated fingerprint system. They had to do it manually with known suspects. Kind of surprised they didn't say, what about Jeremy Scott? He's, known for something like this. They never did. To be honest with you, it's also Leo's attorney's fault. He just never did any preparation. He didn't know about the fingerprints. In his closing arguments, he's saying, wouldn't it be interesting if, these fingerprints would be identified? Well, could have asked for them to be run. He could have done something about it, and he just didn't do it. And so it's not just on the police and the prosecutor, it's also on Leo's defense attorney. And I think it just says a lot about the system. We really don't want wrongful convictions. Somebody should have stepped in and said, run those prints now. And they never ran them until it was requested 15 years later.
Jeremy Scott confesses to the murder, describing details only the killer would know, how he lured Michelle, how he dumped her body. Why wasn't that enough to officially clear Leo Schofield's name? I mean, what's the holdup?
I mean, the real problem with this case is that the prosecutor who put Leo Schofield in prison for life is also the prosecutor who put Jeremy Scott in prison for life for a murder that he committed about a year after Michelle was killed. So he'd gotten away with a couple of murders, finally got caught. And it was the same prosecutor. And I think what happened, this is a big part of the story, is that this prosecutor had a meeting with Jeremy, no witnesses, no tape recording. And basically, this is what Jeremy's side of it is. The prosecutor's dead now. Jeremy's side is that he said he promised to help me with parole if I stuck to the story of saying that I just stole the stereo. That's why my fingerprints were in there. And in the initial response to police, that's what he said. No, I didn't do anything like that. I was just stealing the stereo. That's where my prints were in. And that gave, the state and the judges an easy thing to say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. He was just stealing stereos. Nobody really realistically bought that. And 10 years after that, when he never got any help with his parole, He finally said, I'm coming clean. I killed Michelle Schofield. It wasn't Leo. I got nothing to lose. I'm never getting out. I'm angry now. I'm going to tell you what happened. And that's what he did.
And yet, Leo continued to languish in prison despite the
Yeah.
confession. I mean,
Right. And that's like the catch-22 of it all. It's like, well, he's a liar. He said he didn't do it. And now he's saying he did. Like, you can't trust him. He has no credibility. And that's what they were able to argue to the judge, that, you can't believe a word he says. They did no investigation on him at all. That once they found out that he was willing to say that he was just a stereo thief, that's what they went with. So the truth never really came out.
so Leo is released because of time served. I mean, he's not been exonerated. He is still officially guilty of the murder of Michelle, right? But he's out because he served
Yes.
35 years.
Yeah, in the eyes of the state, he's still a convicted murderer on parole. I do believe that, our story made a big difference in this. I think it kind of changed the narrative, because he'd gone up for parole 3 times. Every couple of years he goes in for parole. And, they basically say, yes, he's been a model inmate, but, he's never admitted it. He's never shown any remorse for his murder. And Leo says, like, that's the only thing I cannot do, is show remorse for a crime I didn't commit. And he said, I just will never do that. It dishonors the memory of my wife, to admit to something I didn't do. And, he was offered deals to get out. He could have been out in the 90s if he'd have just taken the deals. And he just said, I'm not doing it. It's just, I'm not going to say I did something I didn't do. And so, he's talking the talk. And, but I think this time they just sort of decided there was been a lot of attention to the case. They didn't want to keep it going. And I think that that's what they decided, was to just treat him like any other inmate. And, he served 36 years. He's been a good inmate. Let him out on parole. Makes the story go away a little bit.
When you spoke to Leo in prison, I mean, how did he survive? How did he, I mean, knowing he was innocent, and facing that sentence and, 35, 36, 37 years in jail, how does he, I don't know, survive that?
I mean, that's the question, we all try to come to terms with, like, how is this even possible? And Leo's answer is like, you should never even have to imagine it. It's the worst scenario for anybody. You should never imagine it. Like, there's a lot of anger in there, like knowing you're innocent and knowing that the guy out there who's forensically connected to the crime scene, who's a known murderer, is saying he did this too. I mean, Leo believed that. And I think that's where the story really, when you start to understand, like, and I'm still in prison, like, we know this now, and I'm still in prison. That's what he had to wrestle with. And I think that was the thing that was, really threatening to destroy him. The knowledge that the criminal justice could be so bad that we can't solve this case. And he said it was just eating him alive. And the only way that he could really deal with this, the anger and the bitterness, was to just learn to forgive Jeremy. And he's a very spiritual guy. And, he says, I said to God, I forgive him. And he said, God, I know, that I'm lying, because I can't forgive him, but I'm going to keep saying it till you make it true, because I know I need to get to the place where I can live with myself. And he was doing it for himself. He's very clear about that. He says, Michelle's family, I can't forgive him for that. That's their, burden to carry, whether they believe that I did it or Jeremy did it. I can't forgive Jeremy for that. But for me, for my own soul, I need to learn to forgive him to survive. And then he started to, he's the only person in the story who had any empathy for Jeremy Scott. When we were looking at this, the courts didn't, nobody else did. But Leo did. And I think it was from his grace, and his, like, the spirit of redemption and his spiritual being, that allowed us to look at season 2 and see, well, if Leo can forgive this guy and just move on, like, maybe I can still keep talking to him. And so that's what I did. I kept, staying in touch with Jeremy over the last couple of years. We had a relationship built over books. I would send him books, and we'd read and talk about the books. And by confessing to Michelle's murder in detail, and also some other things that he'd done, another murder that he'd gotten away with that nobody knew about, he was able to just help me in my investigations, but also learn to live with himself. And I think that's how forgiveness and redemption became a real big part of season 2.
Yeah, you've spent hours on the phone with Jeremy, hearing his confessions, digging into his past. What's it like to talk to someone who has done such brutal things? And was there a moment where you felt the weight of who he really is?
Yeah, I feel it all the time, and it's not an easy thing to talk about. Like Leo has all this compassion for Jeremy, and but he's a much more spiritual person than I am, and so I'm going into this kind of skeptical. Like I don't at first I didn't want anything to do with Jeremy. I'll just know as much as I can about his crimes, and I didn't really want to go in that route. But after we'd interviewed him, he let us. He started writing me and saying, "I feel a lot better getting a lot of that stuff off my chest." And so as a human being, I would write back to him. And then some things happened. He ended up stabbing somebody else in prison, and there's a whole story behind that we cover, and I think it was episode 3. And he talks about that. He's locked up in solitary confinement, but he gets a phone call every week. And he says, I have nobody else to call or talk to. My family doesn't want to talk to me. I haven't talked to them in more than a decade. So I might as well call you. And so I get these calls from, Rayford, Florida State Prison, like, oh, it's Jeremy. I guess I'm talking to him. And sometimes, sometimes he would just talk about his childhood and some of his memories. And it was just hard to ignore the humanity on this side. I think, one of the most glaring things was that all the remorse that the state was expecting from Leo was coming from Jeremy. I mean, he felt tremendously guilty about what he'd done. He said to us, like, I go to bed at night and I see the faces of the people I killed. That's my punishment. I have to live with this, and it's not easy. And he said he doesn't sleep. But talking to me and getting these things out, I think he said I'm able to sleep a little bit and live a little bit more, and knowing that Leo doesn't have this hatred for me and that I'm possibly helping him in some way is about all I can do. He's never going to be rehabilitated and released. He knows he'll never get out, but can he be redeemed? I mean, that's the question. And as a human being, I think the answer is yes. And you start to see his family, who's never known him, start to come back into the story, including the son he's never met, willing to speak to him now because he heard his father's voice for the first time. And he said, it's not the monster I thought he was.
Did he ever explain what drove him to kill Michelle that night? Did he tell you any details?
Yeah, he did, and he says, like, even in the last conversation with I, he said, I was drunk, I was drinking, and he goes, but that's no excuse for what I did. And because she was in the wrong place, the wrong time. And, he was in a really bad place himself. He started it like all his crimes. They start out as these kind of robberies, going to get some money, going to maybe steal a car, and they go wrong on him. And he resorts to this violence. He's an extraordinarily violent and impulsive person. He's not a premeditated killer. He doesn't have any thoughts about doing this beforehand. So yeah, he explained it to, it just got out of hand. She started to panic. She started hitting him, screaming, and he didn't know what to do. And he had a knife and he used it on her. And he, talked about where he got the knife and talked about, what he did afterwards. And, all of it makes sense. It makes sense a lot more to me than what the state says. The big problem with this case is that in the 3 hours after Michelle called Leo at 9:45 p.m., to the time that Leo calls the police, she's nowhere, no witnesses, no friends know where she was. She's not accounted for. The state could never find a single person to say, we saw her here. We heard her say she was having a fight with Leo. She's going to not go home. Nobody. She just kind of disappeared. Jeremy's story is like, I saw her at a phone booth right when she was calling Leo, and it was kind of raining out. And, she said, do you need to use the phone? And he said, no, I need a ride. And she said, I recognize you from town. And he allowed her to get in the car. And he was driving her back to his trailer where he lived with his grandmother. But he led her back past the trailer into this abandoned little phosphate mine where he used to go and frequently went. And that's where it happened. He was either going to rob her, maybe even sexually assault her. We don't really know. But that's where it happened. That's where they found her body. And it all makes sense. That was a known hangout for Jeremy.
I'm always a little hesitant to try and, provide or give some humanity to people who commit such heinous crimes. But sometimes we have to confront that. What did he tell you about his childhood that might give us a glimpse into why he is who he is.
Yeah, I mean, and that was one of the things, started looking into it, um, because he was sentenced to death. In that there's like a hearing for the penalty phase,
Mhm.
and so a lot of his family members were brought in to testify about his childhood and his upbringing. And so we learned a lot by just looking through that, and also the psychiatric evaluations that were he had to go through. This was a kid who was basically abandoned by his mother at birth. She just didn't want anything to do with him. So she gave him over to his grandmother. And he grew up thinking that his grandmother was his mother, until he finally learned that truth, that his mother didn't want him in his life. So at a very early age, I think he was 2 or 3, he was playing in the driveway, and his father or grandfather was a drinker and backed over him, gave him some brain damage at a very early age. Um, After that, he was, I think, 9 and getting arrested for felonies like stolen cars. He had a record from, before he was 10 years old.
Wow.
Doing all these things. He was homeless and living on the streets at the age of 10, just committing crimes, in and out of foster care, in and out of family situations. He spent his early, like 10, 11, 12, 13, in and out of a juvenile home, being shuffled into these foster homes. Some of them were very abusive. He was clearly being abused and beaten along the way. And, at the age of 15, he's arrested for a murder. His fingerprints are found at the scene, and that's when he starts to go through the serious justice system. But strangely enough, at the age of 15, when he got caught for this murder, he ended up getting acquitted because they couldn't find his fingerprints on the rifle that he had used for this one murder. And the jury said that they didn't think he was smart enough to rub his fingerprints off the murder weapon, so they didn't think he did it, and he got acquitted. And then, went on to commit a murder not too long after that. And so you just see this pattern of escalating violence as a teenager. And as one judge said, it's no surprise to see that Jeremy Scott got caught up in the system like this.
Mm. Did Leo and Jeremy ever communicate or correspond?
Well, it's interesting. They had one meeting face to face at an evidentiary hearing. When Jeremy's fingerprints were found, they brought him into court, and they were down in holding cells. Jeremy was held in a special cell because he was a violent person. And as Leo got called into court, he saw Jeremy there, and he'd already known about him. And he confronted him. And it's something, it's a very powerful scene. He says to Jeremy, he goes, "Know that I know, Jeremy, know that I know." And he said Jeremy wouldn't look at him and wouldn't acknowledge him. And he says that, at that point, I realized I was looking at the man who had killed my wife. And he goes on to tell this other story where they're being transported into the jail, and there's like 33 inmates, and they're handcuffed 2 by 2. And Leo is the only person who's not handcuffed to anybody. And at the other end of the tunnel, they see Jeremy Scott coming in, and they bring him up to the chain gang. And Leo has this moment where, like, tell me they are not going to handcuff me to the man who killed my wife. And he said, if that happens, it's God's will. And it's a traumatic moment for him because he realizes, like, I'm never getting justice. I'm going to take justice into my own hands and get my own justice from the man who killed my wife. And he struggles with this about what is he going to do. And he tells a story. It's brutal. And finally, they get him about 10 feet away from each other. And one of the guards says, stop, like, you cannot move him. And they realize he shouldn't be near each other. And at that point, Leo realized, like, whoosh, this wave of relief. And he says at that point, he starts to change his thinking about it. That's the only time they ever met. And I will tell you, in season 2, Leo's forgiveness and empathy for Jeremy finally comes to a head. And a bit of a spoiler, but it's important. They do end up talking. And it's totally not planned. It happened when I was visiting Leo, and Jeremy just happened to call me at that moment. And it's like, I don't know what to do here. Leo, do you want to talk to him? And I said to Jeremy, like, you're not going to believe where I am. And they talk on the phone. And it's, honestly, I just heard it right now because they're still working on the final episode. And I can't believe what I heard. It's just incredibly powerful. I won't tip it off more than that, but Leo's grace and empathy and Jeremy's guilt and emotion and remorse comes through. And it's an extraordinarily powerful, spontaneous thing. It's not set up. And there's even a kind of moment at the end where I didn't realize that I'd left the recorder on after the phone call ended. And so Leo and I had this kind of question. I just thought the phone call had ended. And Leo's like, man, I just was talking to the man who killed my wife. It doesn't get any more real than that. Like, I, wanted to forgive him, but, today was the test. I didn't know if I could do it. And it's just so powerful. And also just to hear Jeremy's humanity come through and the two men talking together, it's like nothing I've ever heard.
That's so powerful. As we're recording this, we're in the midst of Great Lent, heading into Easter or Pascha, which is all about repentance. That's a powerful story. You were talking about justice, and you've said the justice system delivers verdicts, not the truth. How does Bone Valley Season 2 expose that gap, especially with a confession and fingerprints pointing to Scott?
Well, I think it's at the first part of it, like because of the investigation, and we only had like an hour and a half to meet with Jeremy. We had a lot of ground to cover. He'd never met me before. And so, we weren't really sure how that was going to go. After the continuation, it just became so apparent that he was telling me the truth about all these other, murders that he committed. He talked about them in detail. There's times when I'd be just sitting around. Sometimes I would just listen to him on the phone. He was having a really dark time. He said, I got pepper sprayed in the prison. They took all my stuff away. There's nothing I can do. They took my books. I don't have anything. All I have is a phone to talk to you. And I just realized you're listening to someone in their very worst moments of their lives. And so, I wouldn't ask my questions then, but there were times when he would talk and, he was in a better mood. And I would say, hey, can I ask you about this? There's something you said that I never really knew the answer to. And he would just be candidly and matter of factly like, oh, yeah, that's where I hid the gun. And he would talk about things that he'd seen that were, I could corroborate. And so for me, it was just like this relationship that was built on truth. I didn't, if I felt that he was lying to me about things, it would take on a different tone, but it wasn't. He had nothing more to gain. And I think he was feeling like he really was helping himself and helping him live with his own self by talking about these things. And so, it was just a remarkable insight. It's hard to even explain. I would send him books, and there are times we just talk about books that we were reading. I'd send him books that my kids had read, like, Hunger Games and stuff, and he'd like to talk about that and Game of Thrones. And I started to see just a different part of his humanity. And, not to, he's done awful things, and, there's no way to put a shine on that. But I've been influenced in my own work by the work of like Sister Helen Prejean and Brian Stevenson, who I just think taught me how to look at humanity a little bit differently. And so I was able to do that with him. And I think he came to trust me with his story in the same way that Leo did.
If I'm getting the right Leo Schofield, I was reading earlier today, was he not just recently involved in a serious motorcycle accident?
Yeah, it's just horrible because, we covered his release almost a year ago. He was released from prison and he was put into a halfway house in Tampa. And, with that, he got more freedom. He rode around on a motorcycle, a Harley Davidson, just like he used to do when he was free. He had a job as an auto mechanic and he would go to work every day. His wife moved into the area from Fort Myers. And so he would be able to see with them as long as he met his curfews. And one night in January, he was giving his daughter Ashley a ride on his motorcycle, and they were going along a highway, and a car pulled out in front of them and just had no time to stop, hit it at like 45 miles an hour. Injuries were severe. Fortunately, no head injuries for either of them, but they both broke their pelvises, legs, arms, wrists. They've been in recovery for a couple months. Leo is still in a wheelchair. But yeah, it's like if you look about a person who, like, I don't want to say can't get a break, but has been tested by life, 36 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And then in his first year of freedom in this horrible, vicious accident, he's recovering. His spirits are good. I don't think there's anybody on earth who's more apt and qualified to handle a challenge like this. He's just got this positive spirit, but he's recovering. And Ashley's doing even better than him. She's up and walking around a little bit. So it's a long road back, but I think he'll get there.
And how about Michelle's family? How do they feel about Leo these days?
Well, I can tell you that they're split on it. Um, Michelle's father recently passed away, and he was just of the belief that Leo had done it. And the same with his older son, Ricky, also testified, called into a hearing saying he was against parole. The younger brother, Jesse, kind of looked into it, was kind of curious about it. And he'd come to the belief that Leo was wrongfully convicted. In fact, he wrote a letter to the parole commission saying that he didn't believe in the conviction of Leo and that he supported his parole. And so the family is split on that. I think that's not unusual. But Leo is very careful about this. He came to forgive Jeremy, but he said, it's not my place to forgive Jeremy for Michelle's family. That's for them. I was forgiving him for my own spirit. And to survive in here, I had to learn to come to deal with the bitterness. And also because he cared about Jeremy and he felt it was the right thing to do. He had to learn to get there, and he got there. But he's very careful about that. He says, I can't, it's not my place to forgive for Michelle's family. That's really them. And he's very careful about treading on those grounds. He's very, very admirable human being, in my opinion.
So what's next? I mean, what does real justice for Leo mean at this point? And is he likely to get a full exoneration?
I don't know if he's likely to get it. He definitely should get it. Like, if you want to say like justice should be served and the truth should be honored, he's been wrongfully convicted. It's very obvious that another man committed that. He's forensically connected to the crime scene. And there's some very powerful people in Florida who have taken up Leo's cause and are trying to do something about this. In my experience, a book I'd written that came out in 2012, it's called Devil in the Grove. And it's about the wrongful conviction of 4 young Black men in the same part of Florida. And, there was the same finality on that one. The state had its story, and that was what carried the day. And I went back in and investigated and obviously shown that these men were not guilty. They had been framed and by the sheriff and the prosecutor. And it was very obvious. There was all this evidence that didn't exist back then that existed now. And the state of Florida, to their great credit, finally said, 2019, we got to do something about this. And so Ron DeSantis, when he was running for governor, he said, if I'm elected, that's going to be one of the first things I do. And true to his words, he actually did that. I think it was like his second day in office. He called for a executive clemency meeting, and they ended up pardoning the Groveland boys, calling for a reinvestigation, which ultimately led to their exoneration, posthumous exoneration, 72 years after this crime or alleged crime. Leo keeps telling me, I know he's joking, but he's not joking that much. He says, Gilbert, I don't want a posthumous exoneration. And I said, I know, I'm doing what I can, but your story, I believe in it. It's true. And I do believe it's going to happen. I think back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, like, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think there's no escaping the truth. I think eventually Leo will be exonerated because that's the truth and that's the right thing to do.
And how about for you? How did this investigation and producing this podcast and getting to know Leo and Jeremy Scott, how did it change the arc of your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard. I'm still trying to really process it because it still takes an effect on me, and I'm still dealing with it. I'm still talking to both of these men. I think when I first started this project, I was reluctant to really get involved with Jeremy. I just kind of saw him as like this monster. I'm ashamed to admit it. Leo's the only person that had any empathy for him. And I kind of took my cues from Leo. There was a time where I was talking to Jeremy fairly frequently, and I started thinking, man, I got to tell Leo about this. Like, I'm having a conversations about books. I'm exploring his humanity in these conversations. And, I kind of like went to him, not for permission, but sort of for permission. Like, are you okay with this?
Mhm.
And I'll never forget his words to me. He just looked at me and he's like, oh, eyes got moist. And he's like, Gilbert, I'm proud of you. Like, I want you to do this. Jeremy is part of my story. And, he goes, I want people to know that, I care for him too. I don't want to see him discarded. I don't want to see him mistreated. He's thankful for what Jeremy's done, confessing to a murder, you know, for the only purpose of just saying, I have nothing to live for. I'm never getting out of prison, but I can maybe do the right thing and help somebody who's been serving time for a crime I committed. And I think I took my cues from Leo, and Leo saw that as a very powerful thing. And so I went in that direction. And, I don't know, how has it changed me? I don't know if I could be more empathic, but I did look at the criminal justice system a little bit differently. It's not because I want to see more prisoners released or Jeremy. I don't want to see Jeremy get out. Jeremy Scott does not belong out of prison. I can tell you that, and he will tell you that, and it's the truth. I don't think he's capable of being rehabilitated, but is he capable of being redeemed in a human way? I think he is. And I think that's what our season is all about. Family members coming back to him and giving him one more chance at redemption.
Bone Valley, seasons 1 and season 2 is, it'll be available by the time this podcast is published. How do we listen, Gilbert?
Oh, I think it's everywhere you want to listen to: Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Lava for Good also has it. We'll have it on their website, I think, by the time this comes out. So yeah, anywhere you listen to podcasts, it should be good. I'm really curious, but honestly, we're still tweaking the last 2 episodes, so it's not quite complete. So it feels like it's in process, even though it comes out in a week. And so, like, the story is still really raw to me. I just listened to the final episode, like a sound mix of it today, and I was like kind of blown away by it. And I guess this must be a normal thing in podcasting, but I feel like, boy, we're not finished yet. Like, it's still happening. Things are still happening. So it's just kind of weird to process.
Well, congratulations. I mean, true crime it doesn't do it, to call it true crime, it doesn't do it justice, if I can use that term.
I like that. I might steal that from you, Rick. That was really good.
Gilbert, a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Thanks so much, Richard. I really enjoyed speaking with you today. Thank you.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.